Well, good morning. Welcome to all those who are joining us this morning. Thank you especially to all those of you out online who are watching us this morning. As we do, and you have been doing very regularly, thank you. Let us know where you're listening from. It's really quite fascinating to see all the different places that we get visitors from. Now, yesterday in the church, you may or may not have been here, we had a beautiful wedding, rivaled Charles and Diana's wedding. It was huge, it was great. It was a great family wedding. It was awesome. And if you were here, you would agree with me, it was a great day out. And today, we're coming to church on Sunday, and I want to continue with that theme or the spirit of marriage, of relationships, whether that relationship between you and your son, you and your wife, you and your daughter, someone in the church here, your pastor, everyone. I want to talk about relationships today. What makes a good relationship? How do we do relationships? And the one thing that's clear, and been my experience as well, is that relationships are built around good communication. Actually, I'm going to change that. Good relationships are built around great communication. Communication is the key. You know, there was a lady once, and she was walking through the park, and she's walking through the park happily, and she sees this man sitting on a bench, and he's reading a book. In fact, he's reading a great book. He's eating some fruit out of a Tupperware container, and slowly the woman gathers her confidence because she likes the look of this man, and she gathers her confidence to go and ask him out to have a coffee, to go on a date, but she just thought she could start out by asking him to have coffee. So she gets up the courage and she walks over to the man and takes the seat next to him on the park bench and says to him, "Sorry to bother you. I'm dreadfully sorry to bother you, but I was just wondering, I know this might be a little bit forward, but I was wondering if you would like to have a coffee with me someday." And the man is a little bit intrigued. He's a little bit flattered, actually, because it's a good-looking lady. And he responds, "Sure, I'd love to have a coffee with you one day. But why me? What makes you think that you and I are going to get on so well, given that we've just met in the park unannounced? What makes you think that this will work?" And she says, "Well, look, number one is you're wearing a U2 shirt. U2's my favourite band in all the world. In fact, I went to the concert last time they were here, the very first concert I ever went to. My mum and dad took me to a U2 concert. I love U2. I think that means we would get on great." And the man replies, "Yes, you're right, I love U2. She said, "Second, I noticed that you're reading a Mark Twain book. You see, I was a communications major during university. He's my favourite author in all the world." Well, the man's a little bit taken back, and he says, "Yes, well, I'm an English major as well, and I love this book. I love Mark Twain. In fact, I did my thesis at uni on Mark Twain." And finally, she said, "And thirdly, I noticed you're eating prunes out of your Tupperware container there. It has to be fate because I love prunes. Prunes are my favourite food," she said. "In fact, the fondest memories I have are growing up on the farm where my grandma would give us prunes every morning for breakfast." And the man puts down his fruit and he responds to the lady, "Let's do it. It's a date." Get it? The prune, the date. So, communication. It's important. In fact, it's very important. And I would think that it's very important to any relationship that ever was successful is the art of good communication. Let me tell you a story based around communication. The contractor slowly walked off the site. He was bitterly disappointed, really upset. This project had been going so well. No hiccups, all the materials had arrived on time to the site, the workers were working well together, the supervisors were doing their job, the quality of the workmanship on this building site was great, things were going well, and all of a sudden, all the workers have just walked off site. And the contractor laments to himself to think, imagine all the effort we've put into this project. Imagine all the money that's going to be wasted to this project stop. It was going so well. And yet now everything is over and all the workers have left. What happened? Could it have been a force of nature that wrecked the construction site and ended all the work? Well, no. Did the workers form a union and want higher wages and refuse to work unless they got their pay rise? No. Did they run out of resources? Were they not able to finish the project because they just didn't have enough resources? Well, no. That was not. None of those three were in fact the reason to this project stalling. And the reality is, the reason that the work stopped on this magnificent project, this project that was the best and biggest project of the time, the biggest construction site that had ever been. But the reason that the work stopped, the reason that everyone walked off the site, was because there was a breakdown in communication. There was a breakdown in communication. The workers could not understand each other. And since they could not understand each other, the work came to a screeching halt, never to reconvene. We would now refer this to the story of the Tower of Babel. You see, in Genesis 11, the people begin a project. They want to make a name for themselves. They want to build a tower to the heavens. And God is not so happy about his people trying to build a tower to the heavens. And so he confuses the languages and he scatters the people all over the earth. In fact, God says in Genesis 11:6, he says, the Lord said, if there's one people speaking the same language, they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. If they speak the same language, nothing they plan will be impossible for them. God takes away their ability to communicate, and their effort on the building site fails dismally. What do we learn from this? What can we take away from this? How does this help us with our communication? Because if we're not willing to communicate clearly, we will never be successful in our relationships. I want to say that again. If we are not willing to communicate clearly and concisely with each other, we are going to struggle in all of our relationships. But if we do this communication thing, God tells us that with good communication, nothing is impossible. You know, psychologists teach that the most critical element to a good relationship is communication. Now, the church is God's people, and we are to communicate, or we've been summoned, or we've been commanded to communicate God's message to the world. Therefore, the church needs to have good communication. We need to make sure that there is good communication, and it's taking place in both outside and inside the church and with each other. To make sure there's good communication, because God says with good communication, we are so much more successful. You know, in the last 30 odd years, Leanne and I have done so much counselling, I guess, with our friends who are coming through marital disputes. With friends young and older, we've done so much. We've seen so many of our friends in the 28 years we've been married get together and divorce and remarry, and divorce and remarry. And Leanne and I were talking about this recently, and we both agreed that the overwhelming problem that we see in good marriages and bad marriages, the overwhelming indication of a good or a bad marriage is the good or the bad communication. It's communication, because poor communication leads to the quickness to blame the other person. It leads quickly to us minimising what we would consider to be our fault in the communication area. And we start to think that it's your fault. And I want to say something to you this morning. That in good relationships, you are better than finding fault quickly, finding blame to blame the other person quickly. If you want good relationships, you have got to be better than that. If you want great relationships, if you want outstanding relationships, if you want awesome relationships with your partner, with your husband, with your mom, with your sons, with your daughters, with your neighbours, with your friends, with people inside the church, if you want great relationships, you've got to be prepared to take the hits, because it's not easy. In fact, it's difficult. Communication and grace to forgive are the two biggest factors in any relationship. But you know what? You're going to get hit in your relationships. It doesn't matter how hard you can hit. It matters how many times you can get up off the floor, dust yourself after being hit, and to continue along in the relationship when it would be so easy to quit, when it would be so easy to stand out, it'd be so easy to leave that relationship. But if the relationship is worth something to you, and you want to honour God in that relationship, you are better than staying down. You are better than staying down when you get hit in life with issues in relationships. Because communication, as God says, we can do the impossible with good communication. Well, now, perhaps you're sitting there this morning saying, well, I don't have good communication skills, but it's really, it's not my fault. I'm a millennial child. It's so much harder for my generation to find love and to keep it. Well, you might be right. We might be getting into an area that's a little bit raw. But I think you are better than blaming your status as a millennial, whatever generation you are. You are better than blaming your generation for your inability to have good communication. You might argue it's my parents' fault. My parents didn't have good communication, so I have bad communication. It's not my fault. It was how I was raised. We didn't share our feelings. It was how I was raised. It's not my fault. It's just the cards in life that I have been dealt. It's not my fault that I keep burning relationships. It's not my fault that I can't do communication. But you're better than that, because in Christ, you are better than that. Let me just quickly summarise an article that I read for you before I came out here today. And it's an unabridged article in that I've made cut some out of it. For good reason, rates of depression are on the rise amongst older teens and young adults, hitting levels that we've never seen. And millennials do face some issues that previous generations did not. Previous generations also, though, dealt with hardships. Instead, the author of the article thinks it's because today's youth and young adults simply have been, for a lack of a better word, spoiled, who have sheltered their children from a life of disappointments or delayed gratification. Do you see that? Do you see a generation coming through with disappointments and delayed gratifications? The biggest challenge for the millennial generation is conflict negotiation, and they are often unable to think for themselves. You know, a generation ago, my colleague Piers and I would buy a pint of ice cream and down a shot or two of peach schnapps to process a breakup. Now, some college students feel suicidal after the breakup of a 4-month relationship. Either ice cream no longer has the same magical healing properties, or the ability to address hardships is lacking in many members of the next generations. The era of instant gratification has led to a decrease in what therapists call frustration tolerance. This is how we handle upsetting situations, allowing for ambiguity and learning to navigate the normal life circumstances of breakups, bad grades, no jobs, layoffs, marriage disputes. When we lack frustration tolerance, moderate sadness may lead to suicidal tendencies in those who lack the ability to self-soothe. That article, fantastic article, if you want to look it up to read the whole thing, comes from Brooke Donatone. She's a therapist at GPs in the Washington Post Health and Science section. But it gives us a glimpse of what our generations are dealing with the ability to process tolerance for people, to be able to deal with their frustrations, to be able to handle things when they don't go the way that we want to do, to be able to have effective communication in conflict resolution. And that's the biggest thing I see with lack of communication, is the inability to confront people with decent conversations. In the church, we've always had this thing, I think, where we avoid difficult conversations today to avoid tears tomorrow. So after that reading article, we could agree that in some circumstances, you would have the perfect excuse that it's not your fault. But to communicate, they remind you who you are and whose you are. Because you see, you are a child of God. You are better than using those excuses. If you want good relationships, you need to learn how to get it. Pray about good relationships. Go out and get it. Don't get bitter in your relationships. Get better. Learn from the last ones to take into your next ones. But to be clear, as we've already discussed, it is hard. I don't make any apologies for that. Good communication in good relationships is confronting, and it's hard, and we have to do conflict. But if you want good relationships, you need to take the hits. You need to dust yourself off and go again, knowing that God believes in you, believes that you can handle this, believes that you can deal with this communication. So this morning, I want to have a look at what are some of the things that we can do to deal with conflict in our relationships. What are some of the things that we can do to deal with conflict in our relationships? Be that with the opposite sex, with our ma, with our pa, with the workers, the boss. And look, as we go through some of these things, they're not in any particular order. They're just ways to minimise conflict, to avoid conflict, and how to have good communication in your relationships. My number one topic this morning is good, respectful communication. Good, respectful communication. And the reality, good, respectful communication means that you need to listen more than you speak. Respectful communication means that we need to listen more than we speak. Great conflict resolution in relationships comes from communication. And communication is a two-way street, back and forward between the parties. And a lot of the time, listening is far, far more important than speaking. Leanne and I, in our relationship for 28 years, we've developed a code word. And our code word between Leanne and I is sweetie pie. So when the other party uses the word sweetie pie, that means you've got to be quiet. When you hear the other party say sweetie pie, that's cue to be quiet. It means that the other party is not feeling that you're listening or being respectful in the communication. And when we use the word sweetie pie, that means the listener stops quiet dead and listens. It's the word we use. And when that word comes out, if you ever see Leanne and I use the word sweetie pie, that means if the other party doesn't be quiet and listen, they may end up with a fork sticking out of their eye. Good communication, respectful communication is about listening. We've talked about this just before. But biblically speaking, the scriptures tell us that we can achieve anything with good communication. With good communication, including prayer, we can achieve great relationship in all aspects of our lives. I cannot stress enough to you today that the art of good communication is to listen more than you speak. Second tips, the first one is good respectful communications, which means that we need to listen more. The second marker that we have today is just to choose your battles. Choose the battles that are worth fighting, but be a peacemaker in the relationship. Make peace whenever and as soon as you can possible. Matthew 5:9 says to us, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God." But before we go any further, let's be crystal clear about a couple of things. Let's look at what peacemaking is not. Because we can get confused around what being the peacemaker can mean. Because peacemaking is not avoiding or appeasing. It's not a grin and bear it, sweeping under the rug saying, I keep peace in the relationship because I don't say anything that is not peacemaking. I just keep the peace in this relationship because I just don't say anything. That is not peacemaking. When you say I just quiet and don't deal with the communication, and you say I do it because I don't want to create an argument, that is not peacemaking. It's not. Peacemaking is admitting your faults in the conversation and repenting for those and having good communication. So peacemaking is not avoiding or appeasing, grin and bearing it, or sweeping it on the rug saying I keep the peace in the relationship because I just don't say anything. That is not peacemaking. Third marker this morning is that in our relationships and I guess communication with each other, we need to be tolerant. We've got to be tolerant with each other. Let me ask you a question. Do you always have to be right in your relationships? Do you always have to be right? Even when you're right, do you have to prove it? When Jesus was grilled at one stage by Pilate, Jesus knew that he was in the right. He knew the accusations that Pilate were telling him were incorrect. Jesus knew that he was right. But he also knew that it achieved nothing to argue with Pilate. He knew it was pointless. Nothing was going to change. Men's minds had been made up of who he was, and arguing the fact that even though he was right was absolutely no point and achieved nothing. and it did nothing to aid what his original purpose was. He didn't need to speak and to point out that he was right. In fact, we read in Matthew 26:62, then the high priest stood up and said to Jesus, "Are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you?" But Jesus remained silent. All things that are not important, and all things that are really not that important, do you have to be right? Do you have to prove that you are right? Are you willing to destroy a great relationship that you've built over many years because of your impulse to be right? Is being right more important to you than the relationship? Is pride a problem for you in your relationships? Because grace in the relationship is everything. I'd love to be able to know, statistically speaking, what amount of pride or how many conflicts in relationships are started and continued and cause an end to the relationship because of pride, because of the ability of having to be able to prove that you're right. Sometimes in a relationship breakdown, we might say pridefully, we're just not compatible anymore. We don't get along with each other. We're not compatible anymore. We can't agree on anything anymore. Everything we talk about ends up in a fight. He or she always just has to be right. Well, can't tell you that everyone is incompatible. I want it now, you want it now, and we're willing to let this relationship die rather than we are willing to fight for it. Lee and I have been married for 28 years on the 18th of December, and we are not compatible. And I don't think many of you would argue that or haven't already thought about that. In fact, some of you may have already said it. What was she thinking when she met him? Lee and I are not compatible. We are the opposites from the simplest things like, she's actually really quite nice. I can be ordinary. But when Christ is at the center of your relationship, the greater the differences in your relationship, the greatest differences in your marriage, is the greater the possibility for growth with Christ the center of your relationship. Good relationships are not a matter of compatibility in relationships, but it's a matter of maturity. Sometimes, a lot of times, things that are not important, we can be right, and we don't need to open our mouths to prove that we are right, because we just come across as arrogant and full of pride. Our relationship goal should be to make this thing. Our goal should be not to prove ourselves right. Our goal should be make this relationship stand and go the distance. And sometimes in our relationships, like Jesus did, we just need to remain silent even when we are right. My fourth marker today, it's a good one. It's let's be really careful with our words. To be really careful with our words. Great communications comes from being very careful with our words and not to let, in our anger, sin and to say things that hurt the other party. Some of you may say, but it's the truth. But just the truth on its own is not enough. It's how you deliver the truth. Listen to this. You are never persuasive when you are abrasive. You are never persuasive when you are abrasive. Ephesians 4:29 says, do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for building others up according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen. I'm going to say that again. That's the best advice in relationships I can ever give. And it says, Ephesians 4:29, do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for building others up according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen. What a fantastic scriptural reading for dealing with conflict in our relationships. That what comes out of our mouths should be used to build people up, not tear them down. Because two imperfect people can't make a perfect relationship. Two imperfect people cannot make a perfect relationship. So we need to be really careful with our words. And some words Some words in our relationships with each other we need to take off the table. Some words between Leanne and I have been banned, particularly calling each other similar to our mothers. That is off the table. That has been banned. During the Cold War between America and Russia, both parties agreed that some weapons needed to be taken off the table. It was a truce. There was an understanding that neither party would use particular weapons because both parties knew that if those weapons were used, they both would be destroyed. Sometimes we need to ban certain words in our relationships because we know that it will destroy both of us. In your relationships, you just take some words off the table. Words like, we will just get a divorce. You're just like your mother. You need to ban some words and actions in your conflict resolutions because they will destroy you and everything around you. If it's an issue in your relationship, sit down with your person you're in the relationship. Sit down and discuss the words that need to be taken off the table because they will destroy both of you. For good conflict resolution, please be careful with your words. You know, in a world that likes to think it's so functional, be dysfunctional. Number 5 is be dysfunctional. What do I mean by that? It's an odd thing to say, isn't it, to be dysfunctional? Well, I'll give you an example of what I mean. Leanne and I, in our relationship, we are dysfunctional. We are dysfunctional. We're dysfunctional in the secular world because we do things like we try to be patient with each other. We genuinely like each other. We love each other. We like each other. We stay loyal to each other. We are faithful in all ways to each other. We go to church together. Christ is at the center of our relationship. And in the eyes of the secular world, we are dysfunctional. In the eyes of the secular world, we are dysfunctional. And we're also dysfunctional because we base our relationship on Jesus and his teachings. In your relationships, be dysfunctional. Be what the world is not. Be different to the world and look to a higher love, to the love of Jesus Christ in your relationships. Because the love in your relationship needs to be a biblical love, not a worldly love. It needs to be a biblical love that God had for us. The love that God gives us. The love that led to God sending his Son to die on the cross, to pay the price, to be the bridge for us to be in a relationship with our Heavenly Father. John 4:19 says, we love because he first loved us. We love because he first loved us. When God's love is the forefront of your relationship, it allows you to focus on Jesus first and foremost. And as I say all the time, with Jesus, everything can change in your relationship. The 6th marker that I want to talk to you today is to the men. To the men. Men out there, men in here this morning. To the men. Men. Change the world with how you treat women. Men, change the world with how you treat the opposite sex. Men, if you want to be a radical Jesus follower, if you want to live in the footsteps of Jesus Christ, if you want to be different, if you want your relationship with the opposite sex to be special, you need to honor women. Be a man who sees a lady as the princess of the Most High God. Not a plaything, not an object that you can abuse, that you can violate, that you can just throw away when you've had enough. Men, if you see ladies in your life, your mum, your sisters, your girlfriends, your wife, as the princess of God, it will radically change how you treat them, how you see them, how you honor them. And I promise you with everything that I have, that when you see significant other ladies in your life, if you see them as the princess of Most High, if you see them the princess of our Almighty Father, you will love them as an equal, and you will not see them as a possession or a quest. I mean, if you want to get good in your relationships with your wife and your daughters and your mothers and your sisters, see them as the princess of Most High God. and you will love them accordingly to that. That's for the men. Ladies, very simply, choose wisely. Men, boys, they think differently to you. They want different things to what you want. You need to choose wisely. You need to choose wisely as a female who and what relationship with males you are in. Watch how the men in your life treat other ladies in his life. His sister, his mother, his grandma. Because how he treats the other women in his life will be in time how he will treat you. Pick a man into your life that you'll love, who will treat you like a princess of the Most High that you are. Please don't settle. Please don't settle, because it will end in conflict. I know there's plenty of you here today that will attest to that, who've had relationships end in conflict because of the way men treat women. Women, choose wisely. Watch how the men in your life treat the other women in their lives. Eighth point this morning is for parents. Parents need to be really careful that we don't stereotype our offspring. We have an impression we talked about earlier of what millennials are, which is if you're a parent now or a grandparent, you're dealing with a millennial child. And you've got to be somewhat careful that we don't stereotype them. Because the reality is, we may not know it, but the statistics tell us that the millennial generation just feels as clunky as you do with all this new technology, with what the work culture looks like now. They are struggling to keep up with it as well. They feel clunky in it. They feel clunky on the movements from one generation to the next. They find a lot of the new technology to be nothing short of dehumanizing. And they know it. The statistics tell us that. But if you want to connect with your millennial child or grandchild, again, I sound like a broken record. It comes to good communication. Good communication. Even when you feel like them pushing back, keep going, because the research suggests that the generation coming through is desperate for advice, desperate for relationships with people who have been there, done this and done that. Not that they can just read about on the computer. They are desperate for relationships with people who have been there, done this, done that. And the statistics back this up. They are keen for advice and experience. They just sometimes don't know how to communicate it. They are desperate for knowledge that only comes from experience, not from their smartphones or their computer screens. Grandparents, you need to push through and keep pushing. But I want you to remember something. The next generations coming through that we're parenting and grandparenting, they don't need another friend. They've got plenty of friends. They need a parent or a grandparent who loves them and cares for them and will hold them accountable for their actions. But if you want to do this, if you want to have that relationship with your child or grandchild, you cannot just go into lecture mode when you see things that they're doing wrong. You have to earn the right to be able to speak into their life, which means you need to spend time with them and you need to love them. Parents, grandparents, if you want to know how to connect with your child, to have an uncomfortable conversation, fill their emotional tank first. Do something with them that they enjoy. Dads, get on and play computer games. Mums, go to the hairdresser again, together. Do things that fill their emotional tank. Do things with your child together that fills their emotional tank, and you'll earn the right to speak into their life, and they will love you for it. But if you go straight into lecture mode, if you don't do the work with them first, they will buck against you and they will resent you for it. You have to do the work before you can speak into your child or grandchild's life. You have to show them that you love them. Fill their emotional tank. Do things with them that they love. We've been through some markers there of what we can do in good relationships. If you're liking them, sit down and write them down. But that's good advice on how to deal with our relationships. But great conflict resolution in relationships comes from great communication. And communication comes from a commitment from each other to make this thing work. It's a commitment to each other that we're going to make this relationship work, and to do that we need good communication. And I remind you of the scripture that we read this morning in Genesis about the Tower of Babel, where God says, if they are united, they can do anything. In your relationships, if you are united and you're practicing good communication, in your relationship you can achieve success. You can achieve anything in your relationship. But we need to communicate.